for Horror Games. I'm Danielle Lauzon. I'm going to be the panel host for this evening. And by welcome, I mean really thanks for sticking around. Today we have with us Steffie de Vaan, Meghan Fitzgerald, Matthew Webb, and Conri Purcell. I will let them introduce themselves more fully as we go through, but actually, let's go ahead and do that. We'll start with Steffie. Give us an introduction. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Steffie. I write and develop games. I've written for the Chronicles of Darkness, the World of Darkness. I write indie horror games. I do different genres too, but I tend to gravitate back to horror. So I'm very excited to talk about how you can translate the feeling of horror into dice rolls.
Cool. Matt?
I'm Matthew Webb. I'm a creative partner at Jackalope Live Action Studios, and I've developed and written a variety of horror LARP games, including like little indie games, as well as larger blockbuster productions for White Wolf and Paradox.
Cool. Conri?
Hi, I am Conri Purcell. I am the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Devil's Luck Gaming. We are a streaming site here on Twitch, and we focus on darker gaming, even when we play D&D, a lot of Chronicles of Darkness. And I also am currently working with Onyx Path on some Scarlands content.
And Meghan?
I'm Meghan Fitzgerald. I'm a writer and developer, largely with Onyx Path and a few other companies. I'm the developer for Changeling the Lost and Mage the Awakening currently, both of which are Chronicles of Darkness games. I've written for World of Darkness. I've written for a couple of other horror games, as well as other genres.
Cool. And for those who don't know me, I'm Danielle Lauzon. I'm the line developer for Vampire the Requiem. I work a lot for Onyx Path, doing writing, developing, pretty much if it's a thing, I do it. And then also I've worked on, for horror mechanics specifically, I've also worked on Chill and well, that's it. Chronicles of Darkness stuff, World of Darkness stuff, and Chill. Yep. So let's get this started. So the panel is matching mechanics to content for horror games. So what we're first going to talk about is what we mean by content for horror games. And so I'm going to go around and ask everybody when I say that, it's kind of, what does that mean? What are we talking about? So let's start with Steffie.
So for me, the content would be the suspense part of horror, because there are a lot of games that do combat very well. But horror to me is about the sense of isolation before you start, of having nowhere to turn, having nowhere to run, having to deal with a thing that you don't want to deal with, and the build up, the moments of, did I see that or did I imagine it? Is there actually a clown behind the balloons or isn't there? And that is a lot of content, and that you can do that narratively, but you can also design mechanics to invoke that feeling.
Conri?
For me, it has to be atmosphere and genre evocation. So mechanics work really well when you kind of pull them in, well, content-wise at least, when you're pulling in specific things that can only be found in maybe slashers, or something that can only be found in cosmic horror. Maybe not exclusively, but at least those concepts being brought to the front by the mechanics and what's being put forth by the game.
Okay. Matt?
I would say the content of a horror game, this is very similar to what other people have already said, is whatever provokes an image or an emotion in the player's mind.
Okay. Meghan?
Yeah, just to add to all of that, if we're talking about content and matching mechanics to it, for me that means that the mechanics are creating a specific play experience that the game is trying to evoke. The story, but also, as Conri said, the atmosphere, and the specific player experience that each person is getting through their character.
So, when we talk about content, for matching mechanics, and we talked a little bit about, the different types of horror. So let's talk about horror more in a kind of like, what do we mean by horror when we talk about this? You know, what genres are there? And when we're, you know, we're going to get to the mechanics part of it, but, you know, is it all the same? How does that work?
I don't think they're the same. I mean, I think if you ask anyone to describe a genre, you're going to get 20 different answers from 10 different people. I mean, science fiction and fantasy suffer from that as well. But I think horror is particularly difficult because horror is usually defined as anything that provokes a whole suite of emotions, not just one. There's terror, there's tension, there's, you know, disgust, there's all these various emotional feelings and reactions which inhabit horror. So, and you can really look at the various genres, you can see what the kind of primary and secondary emotional experience they try to provoke is. And you can even look at particular series. The tension that exists in, say, the Halloween slasher films is very different than the gore and almost comedic levels of disgust that exist in, say, Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th. So they have schlock horror, schlock slashers versus plate straight slashers. So it's very difficult to describe, but it's, you know it when you see it, ultimately.
Yes, the porn rule.
I would actually add to that, and to try and kind of funnel that into one word, I would go with visceral. Everything that horror does is visceral, whether it's when it comes to a visceral emotion, an intense emotion, a visceral reaction, somebody's jump scare, visceral revulsion, and making somebody really get the gag factor on. If you're talking about your more hostile like movies and such, like and things like that.
Yeah, and I also think that going back to the genres, because Halloween is a very different movie than Get Out, but they are both horrors. So yeah, there's that sense of tension, that moment that you can't breathe. That for me would be horror. That moment when you feel like you're trapped and you want to get out. I remember I recently watched The Invisible Man, and I know that horror traditionally has a supernatural element that distinguishes it from thriller, but the opening moments, like the first 10 minutes of The Invisible Man, are legit the scariest I've seen in a long time, because I could really imagine what she was feeling at that moment and the intense fear that she was experiencing.
Megan?
One thing that I think is really interesting about the umbrella of genres that is horror is that, so not to go on a tangent, but I have a whole thing about genre because I was a librarian in another life, and I have like a whole thesis on genre and all of that. But the point being that genre is a subjective thing, and it can change over time. And so one thing that's interesting about the horror genre is that certain things that we might consider horror now might not really have been considered horror 50 years ago, or vice versa, because of the various fears that go through society that are very timely. You know, things that people fear now that they didn't even realize were a thing 100 years ago, or stuff like that. That what we call horror now may not even be universal, or may not even, that kind of thing, where it's the emotion that it evokes, but it's also the subject matter that it covers. That people are afraid of something now that's like a very societally timely thing to be afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
Matt?
Yeah, I think even more, to build off of that point, is often one of my favorite things when talking about horror, is to point out to people things which are horror films or horror novels that they don't think of as being horror novels. One of my favorite examples is the original Terminator movie is not an action film. People think it's an action film. It is a horror film. It is about being hunted by something that does not stop. And that is a horrific idea. And the moment you reframe some things which are not considered horror and you simply describe them in a way that is undeniably true, people go, oh, wait, that actually is terrifying. And that is where the tension goes into. So yeah, genre is not just a matter, is so subjective. You can just reframe the exact same thing and it becomes horrific.
All right. So, and to be fair, I did know this. It wasn't just a question, but I wanted to kind of prompt this. So when we talk about, all these different types of horror, right? But horror has a unifying factor, something that brings it together. But we can all agree that there's various different types. There's body horror, there's jump scares, there's dread, there's gore horror, there's splatter porn, there's all sorts of stuff out there that is horror, and we can all undeniably say it's horror. So when we talk about mechanics to match it to content, like, let's start talking about that a little bit. But one of the biggest things that I want to talk about as we go is, do we need to adjust the mechanics that we use to evoke these different genre feels? And I think the answer is yes, but let's talk about how to do that. So when we talk about matching mechanics to content, we're really talking about using mechanics to drive story. So let's talk about what a mechanic is. All right, let's start with Meghan.
A mechanic, I would say, is an abstraction that we use to generate drama or generate generate the results of some uncertain action that we the players don't know how this is going to turn out. So we use mechanics to decide that for us, whether it's dice or cards or something even less specific or mathematical than that.
Okay. So uncertainty, deliberating uncertainty.
Say again?
So you're essentially, mechanics help you determine uncertainty.
Yeah, they help adjudicate something where the result is up in the air.
Okay. Anybody else feel differently about that?
No, I like that.
Okay. Conri? Conri had his hand up first. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I didn't see it.
No, go ahead, Matt.
I would say that there's one other type of mechanic which isn't necessarily a certain. I think there's deterministic mechanics, which always happen. Like, if you do X, you will gain a point in Y, and if you get enough of Y, this happens. So there are mechanics. So a mechanic is also anything whose consequences influence player choice.
All right. Conri, did you have anything to add to that?
That pretty much covers it. I'm fairly sure we'll touch whatever I was thinking about in upcoming topic.
Okay. I have a thing that I wrote down, and it's a question, and it's, is actual atmosphere at a table a mechanic? So if I am a GM and I turn out the lights and I create an effect that way, is that a mechanic?
Only if it has in-game consequences, whether the lights are on or not.
Yeah, I would say it's a mechanic if it ties into making some, what he said, consequences, making an impact on the story or character decisions.
Okay, so now that we know what mechanics are and we know what horror is, let's talk about putting those two things together. Wow. Right. Now that all right, I'm gonna go. I've got everything I need. So now that we know that these two things are, let's talk about putting them together. And the reason I wanted to kind of break them apart that way first was so that we were all very clear about what we're talking about when we talk about, how do we create the kind of horror that we're talking about at the table. And, part of this is for game designers, what are mechanics, but also for GMs, like, Conri, you talk about adding horror to D&D. D&D does not have horror mechanics. So how do you do that at the table?
For me, it was actually infusing the chaotic elements of Warhammer into the magic system and creating a corruption system, adding that as like a 7th stat. Yeah, there's 7 stats in D&D. A 7th stat that slowly builds as they interact with the horrific and the terrible. And every time they would interact with something, they'd have to make a corruption save. So it was similar to an inevitability mechanic of, you're going to have to fight this stuff. It's going to be in front of you. There's no stopping it. and every time you interact with it, there's a chance you could slide a little bit further.
Okay. So when we talk about these mechanics for table feel and that kind of thing, let's I'm just going to kind of open it up at this point to specific mechanics that you like or you think would be good. I'm going to ask for GM advice kind of, but if you have an idea of, I guess, you know, if you're designing a game, this is a great way to do mechanics. So hint, hint, that's fine too. Matt?
I think the easiest way to do it is if you're going into a game and you're trying to introduce a horror element, look for anything which creates anticipation and tension of something bad happening. And the moment you find something like that, it's usually very easy, like you mentioned with the corruption system, where if something is a countdown or something is something which is building up in the background, you can often turn that into a horrific element. Or just anything that builds anticipation. If you're in D&D, put in someone's head that somebody is under a mind control spell to do something horrible, and you can play off of that. One hidden group source of horror in World of Darkness, beyond vampire with its blood pools and frenzy and hunger dice, I would say, like in Maze the Ascension, paradox points can be a horrific element if you establish that they're terrible when they come out. And the idea that the more you do, and I think the moment you start establishing tension of something bad happening, you know, once you've established that there could be a clown behind the balloons, to go off of what Steffi said, then you start looking at the horror elements. And similarly, when you're designing a game, if you have a progression, if you have this promise of something bad, like in 10 Candles, it's the candles going out. In Dread, it's the fact the Jenga tower gets more and more treacherous. This idea that there's something there putting anticipation in is a big step forward, and perhaps the first step.
Megan, you mentioned something about I guess what people are doing at the table. I would like you to maybe talk a little bit about making mechanics that inform what people do at the table.
Meaning, you mean like the decisions that they make, character decisions, or
a little bit, yeah. Like what kind? When you talk about, you talked about that a little bit when we talked about what is content, right? Or what are mechanics? Sorry.
It's okay.
But you talked a little bit about that, and so I mean, I have an answer, but when we think about how do we get somebody to experience something at a table? How do we, as a game designer, make that happen?
So one thing, you had mentioned Chill earlier, and I also worked on Chill, and I've run it.
Same here.
Yes, Steffi too. And one of the things, my players, the thing that they always said made them the most afraid was anytime that I turned a token light. Chill has this mechanic where there are tokens that have a light side and a dark side, and the players can turn a light token dark to do something to their benefit, but then the GM can do it the other way around. And in that game, if you turn the token light, that means that you've activated a monster's power, or you've introduced, hey, there's a monster or a horrific element in this scene somewhere, even if you haven't seen any evidence of it yet. And just having that physical token flip over, or even like we were playing online and then just, adding a tally or something, watching that flip over, all the players would go, oh no. And then they would start to change what they were going to do based on seeing these tokens flip. Or like if all of the tokens were light and they had no tokens themselves to flip, right? It means all the power is in the, not power, but all of the tension is ready for the GM to just snap that string and introduce something. And it really got the players to have that anticipation.
Yeah, I having run it myself, I got the same, like people really freaked out about flipping those. Steffi.
Yeah, on that same token mechanic, what I like is if as the GM you don't flip the tokens, you just start hoarding them and collecting them and,
or just
and raking them in, and you're sitting there smiling like, yeah. And your players are going to clue in, why is she saving tokens?
Yeah.
What's going to happen? I'll be needing these later. But yeah, just that. And you don't even have to do anything. And you might not even have a big plan. Maybe there's absolutely nothing going on and you don't have anything to spend tokens on right now. And it's perfectly safe. But just the fact that you're hoarding them makes players go, wait, are we walking into a trap? So,
Matt?
Yeah.
Oh, the best thing you can do is roll the dice for no reason. I mean, because it's that ambiguity, it's that being hunted feeling, right? It's like the game master is hunting you, and it's fantastic.
I definitely like rolling dice for like yes, no binary decisions behind the GM screen. Just like I'm trying to make a decision for myself, but I roll like a handful of dice and they're like, why is that happening? And I'm like, oh, I don't know.
If you want to add a little bit of twist there, look at them and say odds or evens, and then you roll it and then you go,
Yeah, or just asking like, what's your perception again?
That's a good one.
What order are you guys walking in?
Yeah, I like that too. Who's in the back?
Yeah, exactly that. What's your
Who's
order?
in the back?
What's your perception?
Who's in the back of the party? You know, there's a narrative device in movies, the Macguffin. You know, do you think that that's helpful for, you know, GMing horror games to kind of introduce a something that may show up again later and people didn't realize, oh, that, you know.
No.
Can you define the MacGuffin in that
Oh,
sense?
no, not MacGuffin. Sorry. I just
said MacGuffin's like the Maltese
Chekhov's,
Falcon.
right? To Chekhov's
yes.
gun.
Chekhov's gun. Thank you.
Oh, God.
See? So MacGuffin is actually a term that means something that you're looking for, not something that's there and then use again later.
Chekhov's gun.
Chekhov's gun. Thank you. I know the word. I just
So I would I don't use, unless the Chekhov's gun is Michael Myers standing over there continually every time you look. No, I don't use them as items. I use if I do use items, it's different items like a balloon or a book, but never a repeating item. No, you could, but it's not something I've done.
Okay.
So as far as Chekhov's gun, just the concept, I love that, and I love it. I love doing it even if it wasn't deliberate the first time. Something showed up and it was supposed to be something throwaway, but the players noticed it. I'll bring it back later, just to freak them out. Like, wait a minute, it's back. What does that mean? Not necessarily an object, but anything, you know, a character or just a concept, a piece of music that plays again, something like that. Yeah, I love that concept.
Matt.
So I have a term I've used in the past is actually Chekhov's character sheet. And when I've been doing one-shots or pre-written things, it is when I take a person's character and I add something to it, which is tempting to use, but is an extremely bad idea. And you know, at some point, which no one anticipates, that person will use it. It's just like, yes, you can turn someone inside out if you're really angry with them. Go ahead with that. Do what you will. You know, it introduces this tension and chaos, both in the player who has that, and the moment you've established these things are out there, you can rely on the other players to say, okay, who can do these sorts of things? And it introduces that uncertainty, which is fantastic in a game, and that chaos that you can't help but love as a game master when it shows up.
Conri.
This is kind of a bridging mechanic of this to kind of bring up one of the other things I was thinking about before. I actually have them right here because I run Werewolf every Saturday. Conditions in Chronicles of Darkness. My favorite being Spooked, which is you have this card and you can turn it in for experience points, but to do so, you have to make a dumb horror movie decision. You have to go investigate the thing by yourself, or, hey guys, let's split up. You know, but you get to turn that in. You get a beat of experience out of that, but you are setting up the situation. Now, the way you got that was through some kind of integrity or a breaking point test. I run it every Saturday. Damn, I should know this shit.
Okay.
But
I couldn't say Chekhov's gun earlier. You're fine.
the pendulum mechanic of, hey, something went really good for you. Well, that is now that is a thing that is going to come to bite you in the ass. And one of the things that I've been doing a lot on because it's werewolf, trying to make werewolf scary for people that can transform into 8-foot tall furry killing machines is kind of it's a task. But I've been using perception tests that go exceptional, and I'm like, okay, here's your extra information. It's some horrible information. Now it's time for a breaking point because you just learned the horrible unknown.
Speaking of investigation, I know, a lot of horror games lend themselves well to finding out about the horrible thing. That is that's a different style of horror than I'm being chased by a monster. That is the, we're, kind of the Lovecraftian Cthulhu mythos kind of thing, but also other types of horror are just finding out about the bad thing. Let's talk about like investigation mechanics. How do we integrate investigation mechanics to drive horror?
So I love what Cthulhu does, that the more you find out, the worse off you actually are. I like that for a certain type of horror. Like, now you know, and you wish you didn't.
I like systems like that where also one thing, if you have an investigation system where each thing you find out only raises more questions, I think that's always good for horror, because there's always something more to find out. You never get the whole picture, and that's what's scary. There's something unknown out there and you still don't know. But along those lines though, of you found out and you wish you didn't, and Conri was talking about, who was talking? I don't know. Someone was talking about a mechanic where you do something terrible and it makes you worse, and that's horrible too. Bringing those two things together. If anybody's ever played Mage the Awakening, the horror in that game isn't, oh, something is scary per se, although it can be. Paradox can be terrifying, but it's more often, what have I done? And so the mage slate mechanics and all of the spellcasting mechanics, everything in that game is centered around, you can do anything you want. It's just afterward, you can find out anything. I mean, if you think you're going to keep information away from your mage players, you're wrong. But the important part isn't that they don't know. The important part is that they found out, and then they went further and found out more and did something about it. And who are you? Like, what have you done? That sort of psychological horror is really something I like.
If as an alternative, I love the Call of Cthulhu system, and the knowledge is destruction. Knowledge, what you know, destroys you. The other way of dealing with investigation is to make it a race, because Wes Craven is actually really good at this. If you watch the original Nightmare on Elm Street, the question of what Freddy is what possesses the main characters there, and trying to figure out what he is, why he's doing what he is, and who he was is directly tied to the solution to that game. However, every moment you're spending and every morsel that you're missing of that key means another one of your friends has died. So if you can also make it a horse race, and that really increases the drive and the tension to find out more, but that requires you as a GM to have an onion to peel there that is not going to be resolved quickly, and that's almost impossible in like a mage game.
Right.
Yeah. Conri?
One of the things I like adding into investigations is you never not find something. You'll always find something, but the roll is going to dictate how perfect the clue is. So if you fail abjectly, you're going to get a clue, but it's going to be a piece. It's going to be maybe it's been corrupted in some way that now points you in the wrong direction, so that your quarry is going to get further away, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Steffi, sorry.
No, I was agreeing with Conri.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to say that I think one of the things that we can all agree on for investigation, especially in horror, is that when you're running a good investigation, you should never fail to gain the things that drive the story forward.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's an important clue, or oh, we saw a big footprint and it's heading that direction in the woods, like we still need to know that there's a footprint and it's heading that direction in the woods. You just don't know it's a werewolf. Like that's the thing you missed out on the roll, but we don't you don't see anything. Where do we go now? That should never happen. So yeah. One of the other things we talked about, sorry, Matt, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to move on.
That's all right. That's all right. We got limited
got a lot to get through. One of the things we talked about was inevitable dread. Something, a lot of horror movies do this, where there's, Jason who doesn't die no matter how many times you shoot him, or even Freddy. The horror of something that comes and we know it's going to come and it's an inevitable dread. How do we model that with mechanics?
So I think the new Alien game has I want to say stress mechanic, but I don't know if that's what they call it. But it's a stress-like mechanic where being on the hunt all the time wears you down. And I think that works well. And they also have like rules, because Alien could have been over very quickly if the alien would just eat everyone. Like it's what it does. It's what it's good at. But for some reason it doesn't. But they actually have a system for why it doesn't. And I like that, because I think part of the horror is you see that time and again. It could have been over pretty quickly, but it stalks these kids. And then the reason is because fair tastes better. Mm-hmm. Whatever, Stephen King. But it does work. It makes the story truly terrifying. So any mechanic that incorporates a reason for the monster not to just go straight to and now we're confronting you, but also that while you're building that up, slowly wears down the characters, that they're going, well, we don't want to face this. Being on the run all the time is also objectively hurting our characters. So at some point we're going to have to make a stand. Right. And I like it if you can match to those.
Oh, I was going to say one thing, about what Steffi was saying too, is that you kind of have to balance the inevitable with player agency a little bit too. And so for me, the best mechanics that represent that sort of inevitable dread are the ones where the players are digging themselves the hole, where they're making a decision that is actively making something come or making something happen. And there are some mechanics even in games that are not horror games, but they have occasionally horrific elements to them. Somebody brought up Dread earlier, which is perfect, the Jenga tower, where at some point that tower is going to fall over. But everything you're the one doing it, right? You're the one pulling out the blocks. But there's also, in Exalted, it was obviously not a horror game, but the limit break in Exalted is the sort of thing that I really like, where every point of limit that you get is because you did something to make that happen. But it's still inevitable. At some point, all of the things you're doing are going to come back to bite you. And you are gonna limit break, and you are gonna do something horrific. I think that balance of player agency and inevitability is always good.
Yeah, you want it to be inevitable for the characters.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, it's the players who got themselves into this mess. Yeah. Who got their characters into this mess.
Right.
And ideally, you want the players to want to get their characters into the mess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Conri?
There is a similar, not as personal, because limit break is per character, in another game that's not generally thought of as horror would be the Expanse game. They actually have, if you've ever read the novels or seen the show, there's this concept of the churn, that things are going to go bad, and usually it goes bad when you've done things that are exceptional. So there's this kind of plot balance that's gonna happen, and they even have this they even change it up so that you don't have health, you have fortune, and you can use that fortune to manipulate dice. But the second you manipulate dice, that churn gets boosted up. And the GM has mechanics to, okay, well, you ran out of bullets. I'm going to drop the churn a point. You completely ran out. You can't reload. Now what are you going to do? That element could be brought into many games that involve more horrific elements rather than just, out of bullets, unless you're, Bert in,
Trimmers. I was like, what is it? Okay, Matt?
I think building off of what Conri just said is that having the ticking time bomb is so good. Having any type of doomsday clock that everyone can reference. To pull in a deep cut, there was a really good horror board game from Avalon Hill back in the day called Dracula, which had a big sundown, sun up clock where anything that you could do as an investigator got much more dangerous the moment the sun went down and you had to wait out the night. And it was amusing. I have a friend who's really into those type of games, and it was amusing to see how frantic everything got in the sundown, sun up. So actually things like, to clip off of Aliens, they come at night mostly. Having some sort of pattern or wave of the monster helps establish a time limit. And that's it's such a trope, probably no one will question it at your table.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I want to move forward because we only have about 15 minutes left. And one of the things I want to talk about is, we talked a lot about building mechanics that get us into the game, that get us, scared and intense and that kind of thing. So let's talk about safety mechanics, because those are also mechanics that I think play well into horror games. And specifically because, at least I think that, with proper safety mechanics, you can have more intense horror available at your table. So let's talk about that a little bit. Matt, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so we run the Night in Question, which is an extremely visceral horror LARP. And we spend a lot of time kind of advocating to our players that there's this misconception that safety mechanics dull the experience. And my metaphor is, are you comfortable going 80 miles in a car with a safety harness or with no safety systems whatsoever? So what safety mechanics allow you to do at a table or at any game is to use the phrase we say to go boldly into the dark, where you understand you have a lifeline, so you can go to bad places without being worried of whether this is going to turn on you and whether you're not going to be able to put an end to it. So I think safety mechanics are not just a good idea. I think that you really can't have a real visceral good horror experience without there being some understanding that you can proverbially turn the television off if you need to.
Okay. So what kind of safety mechanics do you think work best with horror games? Steffi? Oh, Conri? It's Steffi and then Conri.
Okay. I would actually say that it starts even before the mechanics. What you need, what is essential for a horror game is, because horror relies so much on removing the characters' choices and agency, is you need to make sure that the players have agency. And you do that through mechanics, but it actually starts sooner, because we can have all the mechanics in the world, but there will still be people who, don't use them, or who do use them, but then secretly don't, or who use them in a bad way. So what you need first and foremost is to establish at the table that it's always okay to check in with each other, and to tell the GM to fuck off, and to halt the game, or whatever it is you need to do to feel safe, because all the mechanics in the world are not going to protect people from bad GMs. So I think it's important that we as a gaming community foster a sense of it is absolutely okay to look out for each other, and to hold both players and GMs accountable to the safety mechanics that we are providing with the games. So I actually think there's a larger issue at hand than all the safety mechanics we can put into the game.
No, I agree with you there. So, yeah. Conri, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and to quickly note on what Steffi was saying. I think understanding the social contract between GM and player and just everybody at the table together, that can be reinforced and established at the first thing that I always do is one, there should always be a solid session 0, even if you're at a one shot at a con, 5 minutes before the game, just quickly going over what themes we're going to be playing, what type of game this is, and your safety mechanics that you have in place is enough to call it a session 0. So I refuse to accept that there can be no session 0 at a one shot or something like that. You can always put that down.
Yeah.
And for the sake of all is it holy, do not allow this false bravado of, I don't use safety mechanics, so I'm more badass or whatever, ever erupt. Get rid of that.
Yeah.
One of the things that we nobody mentioned that I personally really think is very important, especially for horror games, is content labels. I'm going to call them labels because, you can put everything on the label and it's not necessarily a warning so much as, this is the kind of horror game we're going to do. This is the kind of mechanics we're going to use. These are the kind of safety mechanics we're going to use. These are the things that are going to show up in this game. And, if any of that doesn't, strike your fancy, then maybe it can be negotiated, but some of it may be important to, whatever story I'm trying to tell. And if you don't like it, then maybe don't join the game. That's a thing that we, as gamers, we don't talk about a whole lot, which is that not every game is for every person. And, if we're all getting together and we're like, we want to play a game and we're going to get together and discuss it, then that's one thing. But if, especially if you're doing a one shot, at a convention and having all that stuff listed out so people can make an informed decision on whether or not they actually want to play in that game, and then also do your 5-minute session 0, like you talked about, Conri.
Yeah. Actually, I recently wrote a session 0 guideline for, I don't remember the game, but I did a session 0. And actually that part of it's entirely possible that during the session 0, you find out that this game isn't for you. That was actually in there. Like, that doesn't mean it's a bad GM. It doesn't mean you're a bad player. It just means that in this game, you're not a match. So it's perfectly okay to get up and walk away and be like, this is not my jam.
Yeah. Conri?
I mean, I have a little anecdotal thing about that, but to give an example, I was planning on running a Promethean game, and a very good friend of mine was going to be playing in it, but she was mid-transition, and I gave the full, and if you want to look at it as an analogy, it's an ingredients list. This is what's going to be in the soup. And as hearing Promethean, which is a very heavy game about identity and discovering yourself, it was understood this is a bad time for that game. I said, yeah, sure. All right. I still want you to play in the game. So we switched to Hunter, and we all had fun still.
Great. Matt?
Well, just as important to include into your content list is your no's, I think. There are some things which you shouldn't put in. There are just some bad stuff that maybe if you're dealing with blood, gore, viscera, and all that, you don't want to deal with everything at once. And I think it helps communicate, A, to people where you're not going to go and make them more comfortable, and B, give you something to point to so that if a player decides to go in a direction, you go, wait. And you should also say that the no list, you are open to adding things.
Yeah.
And you should always solicit that feedback. If something is stated as someone isn't on the no list that someone feels should be.
Yeah, or even if you find out halfway through the game, if something is introduced and you're like, no.
Yes.
And there was one thing that we had talked about earlier. I think it's important to remember too, with safety and mechanics, but also just this conversation between the players and the GM and everything, is that we were talking earlier about how sometimes you can intimidate quote the players to make them feel oh, this is scary, and that's great. But one thing I think is really important to remember, especially in horror, when you're just your approach to the game, is that it's not the GM versus the players. It never is. The entire point of the horror mechanics, of the anticipation, of freaking people out and all of that stuff, is to give them an experience that they're going to enjoy. The GM, as a GM, you're facilitating their enjoyment. It's not you against the players. I think that's something that a lot of people have trouble when the mechanics are, hey, I'm the GM and I'm going to do something to you now. Some people, I think, have trouble distinguishing those two things. It's really important in the safety mechanics and even just the conversation to differentiate between the relationship between the players and the GM and the characters in the thread.
Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes left.
Can I touch on aftercare briefly? Because
yes,
I think that's
please.
important with horror games.
Please.
Because you're inviting the GM to scare you. That's part of why you're playing a horror game. But especially then, I think aftercare is important to let people come back down and feel safe again before you send them out into the wide world. You know, much like in a movie theater, you might wait until the credits have rolled so that you're no longer terrified of somebody standing outside with a knife or whatever it is that was in that movie. So aftercare for horror games is very important.
Yeah, and I mean, we didn't really talk about pacing, but pacing is a mechanic that can also like help with just quickly say that like you can slow up your dread and kind of give a comic relief. A lot of zombie horror includes lots of comic relief in it because you can't just have this like driving horror constantly without having some kind of relief, because essentially you get desensitized to it. So incorporating pacing and thinking about that when you're trying to do a horror game is really important. Matt.
Yeah, and the really easy GM trick there is to bookend your experience in some way. Turn the lights back on, change the music, and make a change of space, and always solicit feedback at the end. Always. Yes, yeah. And that's good for any GM, but in horror in particular.
So really quickly, we kind of covered games that we think do this well, but I just want to go around and just ask people your favorite horror games. So we'll start with Conri.
For me, I go straight for Chronicles of Darkness. When I'm going to do horror, it's pretty much got everything in the toolbox I need, whether it's going to be cosmic horror and go God Machine, or I want What Have I Done horror with werewolf or mage. There's body horror and Promethean. It's the smorgasbord, and there's always a mechanic that's easily adaptable for what I want to do. So Chronicles of Darkness is my first go-to in any situation.
Great. Megan.
I'm gonna have to agree with Conri. Yeah, Chronicles is my favorite, definitely, for sure, and a lot of it is because of that psychological horror element to it. But as Conri said, there's all kinds of different things that you can do with Chronicles. Is my favorite one. But I do want to also mention Chill. That we had talked about it before. I think that Chill is just a very, very effective horror game that's also pretty concise. It's very easy to run one shots.
Matt.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to break from pattern. I'm gonna say if I'm going for straight horror, I find the indie RPGs are the ones that don't have to serve too many audiences at once. They can be straight to the hilt. So 10 Candles, but really my favorite has to be Dread. Dread is the best for especially for convention games. It is just a fantastic horror game that does that pure. It's just so pure on point, and you can tell almost anything in it.
Steffi.
So yeah, I love 10 Candles and Dread too, because the mechanics really work in making you terrified. But I also love the Chronicles of Darkness, and for horror, actually, I think the most terrifying of the lot is Promethean. I genuinely, I will fight anyone on that. I think that's the scariest one we've got in there, to be a Promethean.
Cool. All right. Well, I've got 1 minute. So let's quickly tell everybody where you can be found if they want to keep up with you. Conri?
I can be found on Twitter at the Conri and at Team Devil's Luck for the channel and personal accounts. Also, twitch.tv/Devil's Luck Gaming, where every Saturday running something, and we have games and little shows throughout the week. So that's where you can find me.
Megan?
I am at Fitzmorigna, FITZMORRIGNA on Twitter.
Okay. Matt?
I can be found, my personal account is at Matt Stormcrow on Twitter, or you can find my company at Jackalope LARP on Twitter.
Steffi?
Okay. I'm 100 Things I Love on Twitter, and that's 100, it's 100, it's the number. Things I Love.
I am Impernious on Twitter, and you can also find my website at DanielleLauzon.com. Everybody, thanks for coming out or sitting in and watching our panel.
Don't come out.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
No, stay inside.
Have a great night or evening or late night, depending on where you are.
And remember that noise was perfectly normal.
Yes, I think we're still live. So.
There's no clown behind the balloons.